The auction room smelled like old money and fresh cruelty. Vivian Oakes had learned to recognize that particular combination, the sharp cedar of expensive cologne layered over something colder, something that had nothing to do with fragrance. She stood near the back wall of the Dominion Arts Center's grand hall, a glass of sparkling water in her hand that she hadn't touched, watching the crowd the way she always watched crowds, carefully, quietly from the edges. The annual Hartwell Foundation Gala was the kind of event that appeared in the social pages of every major Canadian newspaper the following morning. 300 guests, each one hand-picked, each one wearing something that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The chandelier overhead was original, restored at some absurd expense, and the light it threw was deliberately flattering, the sort of light that made even ordinary faces look like they belonged in oil paintings. Vivian's face, she had been told many times, was not ordinary. Her face was the problem, according to her ex-fiancé, Marcus Webb. Her face was fine, he'd said once, in that particular tone men used when they meant to be cutting while sounding reasonable. It was the rest of her that was the issue. She'd replayed that sentence approximately 400 times since the night he said it, which she recognized was not healthy, but couldn't seem to stop. She was 31 years old. She was a forensic accountant who had quietly dismantled 2 separate money laundering operations before most of her colleagues had finished their morning coffee. She had a cat named Brisket who was deeply unsociable and whom she loved completely. She was, by any reasonable measure, doing fine. She was also, by the measurements Marcus Webb preferred, too much. Too wide in the hips, too soft at the waist, too comfortable with herself in ways that apparently made him uncomfortable. She hadn't wanted to come tonight. She'd come because her firm had sent her, and because Vivian was the kind of person who showed up even when showing up was the last thing she wanted to do. The crowd shifted near the entrance and something changed in the room. A current of attention moving like wind across still water. Vivian noticed it the way she noticed everything, without being noticed herself. He walked in without announcement, which was its own kind of announcement. She didn't know who he was at first. She catalogued him the way she catalogued everything. Tall, dark suit that was not expensive so much as exactly right. A stillness about him that suggested he had never once in his life needed to fill silence to feel comfortable in it. 2 men flanked him at a half-step's distance, not bodyguards in any visible sense. Just men who happened to be close and happened to be watching. "That's Rowan Callister," said the woman next to Vivian, a junior partner from another firm who had been trying to make conversation for 20 minutes. "He bought the Pemberton Tower last spring. Cash." Vivian made a neutral sound. She didn't follow real estate. "He doesn't usually come to these things," the woman added, with the particular reverence people used for men who didn't need to be anywhere, but occasionally chose to be somewhere. "Nobody knows much about him. Which is, you know, interesting," Vivian said, though she wasn't sure she meant it yet. She turned back to the auction catalogue she'd been studying. She had been sent here to observe a specific transaction that her firm suspected was being used to move significant funds through the arts sector. Nothing proven, nothing even close to proven, just a pattern she'd spotted that nobody else had thought to look for. She was here to look, not to be looked at, which was why it surprised her 10 minutes later when she looked up from her catalogue and found Rowan Callister looking directly at her from across the room. Not at the room, not in her general direction, at her specifically with a focus that was so unhurried. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. She looked back down at the catalogue. She looked up again. He was gone. She told herself this was fine. She told herself she was not thinking about it. She was still telling herself this when Marcus Webb appeared at her elbow. She smelled his cologne first. Something aggressively citrus that he'd started wearing 3 years ago when he decided he was the kind of man who had a signature scent. Her whole body went still in the particular way it did when something she'd been braced for finally arrived. "Vivienne." He said her name like he was correcting a mistake. She turned slowly. "Marcus." He looked the same. She'd been half hoping he wouldn't. Half hoping for some visible karmic damage, which was its own kind of information. He was with someone, a woman she didn't recognize, thin in the way the women Marcus preferred were thin, in a dress that was doing everything right by his particular standards. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said, and his tone managed to imply that the Hartwell Gala had not quite lived up to expectations as a result. "My firm does work for the Foundation," Vivian said. "Right." He glanced at her catalogue, at her glass of water, at the general fact of her. It was a glance she recognized, the inventory glance, the tallying up glance. "You look, Marcus." The woman with him touched his arm, not warmly, more like someone pressing a button. "She looks well," the woman said in the voice of someone who had decided to be gracious and wanted credit for it. Marcus smiled. It was a smile Vivienne had once found charming. "You've been comfortable, I see." The word landed the way he meant it to. There was a beat of silence, the kind that stretched. Vivienne was aware of several people nearby, the specific quality of their not looking that meant they were absolutely looking. Her face felt warm. Her hands, she noticed, were very steady. She was trying to find the right thing to say, the thing that would be precise and final, and not cost her anything she couldn't afford to spend, when someone appeared at her left, not intruding, not inserting, simply present, in the way that certain people were present, with a gravity that rearranged the space around them. "Vivienne," said Rowan Callister, and the way he said her name was so entirely different from the way Marcus had said it that she almost didn't recognize it as the same word. He was looking at Marcus. His expression was pleasant in the way that calm water was pleasant. Smooth surface, no indication of depth. Marcus blinked. "Sorry, do you two?" "We do," Rowan said simply. He didn't offer his name, he didn't explain. He picked up Vivienne's untouched water glass, set it on a passing server's tray, and replaced it with a glass of something amber from his own hand. "I've been looking for you. There's a piece in the East Gallery I want your opinion on." Vivienne was not a person who needed rescuing. She was also not an idiot. "Of course," she said. "Excuse me." She walked away from Marcus Webb for what felt, with each step, more and more like the last time. In the East Gallery, the crowd was thinner. The piece Rowan had mentioned was a large oil, a winter landscape, a frozen river, the sky that particular shade of grey that Ontarians recognized as home. Vivienne stood in front of it for a moment. Before she said anything, "No," he agreed. "You didn't have to do that. I'm aware." He was looking at the painting. "I also didn't have to watch that man say something cruel to you and do nothing about it." Vivienne considered this. He didn't technically say anything cruel. He said comfortable in a tone that would strip paint. Rowan glanced at her then. "I have a reasonable ear for tone." She almost smiled. "Who are you?" "Rowan Callister." He paused. "That probably means something to you now that someone's told you about the Pemberton Tower." "It means slightly less than you might think," Vivienne said. "I'm in forensic accounting. I care about patterns, not landmarks." Something shifted in his face. "What kind of patterns?" "Financial, the kind that look like coincidences until they don't." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the winter river. "And what brought you here tonight?" "Work," she said. "You?" "The Foundation does legitimate work," he said. "I like to support legitimate work." She noticed the word legitimate. She noticed the particular placement of it. She filed it, the way she filed everything, in the part of her mind that was always taking notes. "Thank you," she said. "For earlier. You didn't have to. You already said that. I meant it more the second time." He turned to look at her then, fully the way he'd looked at her from across the room. That unhurried, direct attention that she was still not quite sure what to do with. In the gallery light, which was softer than the chandelier light in the main hall, she was suddenly, uncomfortably aware of herself. The dress she'd chosen carefully, the body the dress covered, the inventory Marcus had performed with his eyes 10 minutes ago. "Whatever he said to you," Rowan Callister said, in the same quiet, even tone he'd used for everything, or implied, or suggested, he was wrong. Vivienne said nothing. "I'm not telling you that to be kind," he said. I'm telling you because it's factually incorrect, and I have a reasonable ear for that as well." She looked at the frozen river for a moment. The painter had caught something true in it. The way Canadian winter light had that specific quality of honesty. Everything stripped bare, nothing to hide behind. "You're very strange," she told him. "Yes," he said, without any apparent concern about this. "Can I get you something to eat? The canapés near the east entrance are considerably better than the ones by the bar. Someone in the kitchen knows what they're doing." She laughed. It surprised her, a real laugh, unguarded. "How do you know that?" "I came early," he said. "I was hungry." She let him lead her to the east entrance. She ate 3 of the canapés, which were in fact considerably better. She told him about the frozen river painting and why she thought the artist had gotten the light exactly right. And he listened in the particular way that some people listened, where you could tell they were actually following, rather than waiting for their turn to speak. She did not think about Marcus Webb for 47 minutes. And then, Marcus Webb made sure she would have to. She heard him before she saw him. That laugh, the one he deployed, when he wanted a room to know he was comfortable in it, cutting across the conversation from the direction of the main hall. She turned, and he was there with a small group, and he was gesturing toward her. She caught one word. She caught it clearly, because the room had dipped into one of those unpredictable silences that happen in large gatherings. The word was fat. Not directed at her, described. She was being described to the group around him, with the clinical detachment of someone explaining a mild inconvenience. The silence that followed was not long. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Rowan had heard it. She knew he had heard it because she was watching his face when it happened, and something changed in his expression that was very quiet and very complete, the way a door closes. "Excuse me," he said to her, pleasantly. "Don't," she said. He paused. "Please," she said. "I don't want a scene. I don't want to be the reason for a scene." Rowan looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right." He didn't go toward Marcus. He stayed exactly where he was. He picked up a canapé from the tray of a passing server, held it out to her, and when she took it, he said, very quietly, "He's going to remember tonight for the wrong reasons. That's already done. You don't need to do anything." She didn't understand what he meant. Not then. She understood 3 days later, when Marcus Webb was quietly disinvited from 3 separate board positions he'd spent years cultivating, when 2 of his largest clients filed for the termination of their contracts on the same morning, when the industry newsletter he'd considered a guaranteed ally published a piece, sourced, careful, devastating, about a pattern of unprofessional conduct that several colleagues had been waiting years to document. She didn't know any of this directly. She heard it from a colleague who mentioned it over coffee, with the particular satisfaction people felt when someone who had been difficult for a long time was finally being difficult for the last time. She thought about Rowan Callister's voice. "He's going to remember tonight for the wrong reasons." She called the number he'd given her, which she had told herself she was keeping for professional reasons. He answered on the second ring. "I think I understand what you meant," she said. A pause. "Do you? I'm a forensic accountant," she said. "I understand patterns." Another pause, longer. "And whether the pattern I'm looking at is the one I think it is, before I decide what to do with it. That sounds," he said, "like a conversation that requires better coffee than either of us probably has at home. There's a place on Elgin Street that opens at 7. If you're willing to be there at 7, I'll explain what I can." She was there at 5 to 7. He was already inside, which told her something. The coffee was very good, which told her something else. She did not tell herself she was not thinking about him. She had given up on that particular project approximately 45 minutes into the Hartwell Gala, standing in front of a frozen river painting with a man who had a reasonable ear for cruelty and an exact knowledge of which canapés were worth eating. They sat across from each other with the morning coming grey and clean through the window, and she asked him a question she already suspected the answer to, and he answered it with more honesty than she'd expected. which recalibrated everything she'd been calculating. There was a moment just before the second cup of coffee when he looked at her the way he'd looked at her across the auction room, then said her name, just her name, and she thought, "Oh, this is going to be complicated," she thought. "Good. You know what you're getting into," he said, "not a question, an acknowledgement." "I know what the pattern suggests," she said. "I'm good at patterns." "You are," he agreed. "I noticed that about you. When, 30 seconds after you walked into the room," he said, "you were reading the catalogue the way most people read maps, looking for something specific that the surface wasn't showing." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Outside, Ottawa was waking up, wet and cold and indifferent, the way cities were in early April when winter hadn't quite admitted defeat. "What were you doing there last night?" "Actually, I told you, I support legitimate work." "And the other work?" "Someone has to." It was not the answer she'd expected. It was also, she thought, the most honest answer available. "I'm going to need time," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm not someone who moves quickly." "I noticed that too," he said. "You held that water glass for 40 minutes without drinking it. You were waiting to see if anything required you to have your hands free." She stared at him. "I pay attention," he said, not unkindly. "It's a professional habit. We probably have that in common." She thought about a man who had looked at her body like an inventory. She thought about a man who had looked at her hands like they were something worth understanding. "7 tomorrow," she said. "Same place." Something in his face, very small, settled. "I'll be here at 5 too." She left first. She walked out into the grey April morning and didn't look back, because she'd learned a long time ago that the things worth staying for didn't require you to check whether they were still there. Brisket was asleep on the radiator when she got home. She sat on the couch and thought about frozen rivers and patterns, and the particular quality of a man who responded to cruelty, not with anger but with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided how the story ended. Marcus Webb had called her comfortable, had meant it as a verdict. She thought, "Yes, I am." She thought about Rowan Callister saying her name in a room full of people performing for each other, and meaning it the way people meant things when they had nothing to prove. She would figure out the rest. She was good at figures. Outside, the first real rain of spring began, and Ottawa softened under it, and Vivian Oakes made a fresh pot of coffee and sat with her cat, and the quiet and the feeling, unfamiliar, a little frightening, mostly good, of something beginning.